Most of what drains your peace is not what's happening in your life, but what you keep trying to control that was never yours to control in the first place. You wake up thinking about people's opinions, you replay conversations in your head, you worry about outcomes that haven't even arrived yet. You try to manage how others behave, how life unfolds, how situations should go according to your expectations. And slowly, without noticing, your mind becomes a place of constant tension. Detaching yourself doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop suffering for things you cannot influence. There is a clear line in life that most people ignore. On one side is what you can control, your effort, your discipline, your choices, your words, your reactions, your habits, your focus. On the other side is everything else. People's judgments, past mistakes, future uncertainty, random events, timing, outcomes, and other people's behavior. The problem begins when you live as if both sides belong to you. When you try to control what people think of you, you lose peace. When you try to control how situations turn out, you lose presence. When you try to control things that are constantly shifting, you become mentally exhausted. Detachment is the ability to say, I will do my part, and I will let go of the rest. You still show up. You still work hard. You still try your best. Stop attaching your emotional stability to outcomes you do not own. Think about it. How much of your stress today is coming from something you can actually change right now? And how much is coming from fear, imagination, and expectation? Most suffering is not created by reality. It is created by resistance to reality. When someone misunderstands you, your peace is not disturbed by their misunderstanding, but by your need to be understood by everyone. When something doesn't go your way, your frustration is not from the event itself, but from your attachment to how you think it should have gone. Detachment is not emotional coldness, it is emotional intelligence. It is seeing life clearly without trying to bend it into your personal script. There's a strange freedom that appears when you stop over-controlling everything. You start to notice how much energy was wasted on things that never responded to your effort anyway. You realize you were mentally arguing mental reality instead of living it. You cannot force timing. You cannot force people to change. You cannot force outcomes to align with your desires. The more you try, the more life feels heavy. But when you shift your focus inward, something changes. You start building strength instead of chasing control. You start improving your response instead of obsessing over the event. You start mastering yourself instead of managing the world. Detachment is built in small decisions, not reacting instant, not assuming the worst, not replaying what you cannot fix, not trying to predict every outcome, not giving unlimited attention to things that do not require it. You begin to ask a simple question in every situation. Is this under my control or not? If it is, you act with full responsibility. If it is not, you release it without negotiation. At first, your mind will resist this. It will say you are being careless. It will say you are giving up control. But in reality, you are taking back control from illusions, because worrying is not control. There is peace in accepting that life will never fully align with your expectation. There is strength in realizing you were never meant to control everything. There is clarity in focusing only on what your hands can actually reach. And slowly your mind becomes quiet. Not because life becomes perfect, but because your resistance to life reduces. You still feel things, but they no longer break you. You still care, but you are no longer consumed. You still aim high, but you are no longer dependent on outcomes to define your worth. That is detachment. Not absence of effort, but absence of unnecessary burden. Not distance from life, but distance from life, but distance from illusion. And when you learn this, you don't escape life. You finally start living it without being controlled by it. Most people spend a large part of their mental and emotional energy trying to influence things that were never designed to be influenced by them in the first place. They wake up and immediately start thinking about how others will perceive them, how situations will unfold, and whether external conditions will align with their expectations. This creates a constant internal struggle because the mind is invested in outcomes that are not under personal authority. Real peace begins when a person clearly understands the difference between what is within their control and what exists completely outside of it. What you can truly control is limited but powerful. Your effort, your discipline, your habits, your level of honesty with yourself, your willingness to act, your ability to learn, your response to situations, and the direction you choose to take in any given moment. These are internal levers that directly shape your character and your growth. Everything else exists beyond that boundary. The reactions of other people, the opinions they form, the timing of events, the unpredictability of life, the results of your efforts, and the way circumstances shift without warning are all part of a system that no individual can fully command. Yet, many people act as if they can manage both sides equally. And this is where suffering begins. When you invest emotional energy into things you cannot control, you begin to lose stability because your sense of peace becomes dependent on unpredictable factors. For example, you may put in your best effort into something and still expect a guaranteed outcome. But life does not operate on guarantees. You may speak carefully and still be misunderstood. You may work hard and still face delays. You may treat others well and still not receive the response you hoped for. Your emotional state is tied to these results, then every unpredictable outcome becomes a source of frustration. But when your focus is placed only on what you can control, your attention shifts from outcomes to effort, from external validation to internal alignment. This shift changes how you experience life. Instead of constantly asking what will happen, you begin to add. Instead of obsessing over how others might respond, you focus on whether your own actions are correct and meaningful. This creates a grounded mindset because your peace is no longer distributed across things that can change at any moment. It is anchored in your present ability to act responsibly and consistently. You stop trying to force life into a specific shape and start working with what is actually in front of you. Understanding control also helps reduce unnecessary emotional reactions. Many reactions come from expectations that were built in the mind without considering reality. When reality does not match those expectations, frustration appears. But if expectations are reduced and replaced with acceptance of uncertainty, then emotional turbulence decreases. You still act with intention, but you are no longer shocked when things do not follow your script. This does not make you passive. Instead, it makes you precise. You begin to conserve your energy for things that actually respond to your input rather than wasting it on things that remain unaffected by it. There is also a deeper level to this understanding. When you focus only on what is within your control, you begin to build a stronger relationship with yourself. You become aware of your own discipline, your own consistency, and your own ability to improve. This creates real confidence, not the fragile kind that depends on approval or results, but a stable kind that comes from knowing you are doing what is right regardless of external outcomes. Over time, this mindset removes the emotional weight of trying to manage everything at once. Life becomes simpler, not because problems disappear, but because your responsibility becomes clear. You stop carrying what was never yours to carry. And in that space, clarity replaces confusion and steady action replaces mental noise. Most of the pressure that people carry on a daily basis does not come from the actual events happening in their lives, but from the meaning they attach to those events and the mental resistance they build against things they cannot influence. When a situation unfolds in a way that is unexpected, the immediate emotional reaction is often not caused by the situation itself, but by the internal conflict between reality and expectation. The mind had already created a preferred version of how things should go, and when life does not match that internal script, stress appears. This is why two people can go through the same situation and experience completely different levels of emotional disturbance. One may remain calm while the other becomes overwhelmed. Even though the external event is identical, the difference lies in attachment, not circumstance. Attachment to outcomes creates a constant background tension because it places emotional stability in a place that is unstable by nature. When a person becomes attached to a specific result, they begin to mentally rehearse that result repeatedly. They imagine success scenarios, fear failure scenarios, and build expectations that feel real in their mind. As this attachment grows stronger, the nervous system starts reacting as if the imagined outcome is already guaranteed. This creates pressure because the mind begins to treat uncertainty as a threat. The more importance is given to a particular outcome, the more emotional weight it carries, and the more distress is experienced when that outcome is delayed, altered, or completely changed. A major source of stress is the illusion of control over external factors. People often believe that if they think enough, plan enough, or worry enough, they can influence events that are fundamentally outside their reach. This creates a cycle where the mind tries to solve problems that are not solvable through thought alone. Instead of releasing what cannot be controlled, the mind repeatedly returns to it, analyzing different possibilities, replaying scenarios, and attempting mentally secure an uncertain future. This process does not reduce uncertainty, it amplifies it internally. The situation outside remains unchanged, but the experience inside becomes heavier and more exhausting. Another layer of stress comes from emotional dependency on outcomes. When self-worth becomes linked to results, every external event becomes a measurement of personal value. Success leads to temporary relief, while failure leads to self-doubt. But because external outcomes are never fully predictable, this creates an unstable emotional foundation. The person is constantly waiting for confirmation from outside conditions to feel secure inside. This dependency makes even small uncertainties feel significant because they threaten not just the outcome, but also the sense of identity tied to it. Much of human suffering is also created by resistance to what is already happening. Instead of accepting the present moment as it is, the mind often argues with it. It says things should be different, that something went wrong, that a better version of events should have occurred. This resistance adds an extra layer of emotional friction on top of the situation itself. The event is one thing, but the rejection of the event creates additional suffering. Stress increases not because life is always difficult, but because acceptance is often absent. When attention is constantly directed toward what might go wrong or what should have gone differently, the present moment loses its stability. The mind stops engaging with what is actually within reach and becomes trapped in possibilities and regrets. This creates a mental environment where peace is always postponed. Instead of experiencing life directly, the person experiences their interpretation of life, filtered through expectation and fear. This separation from reality intensifies stress because the mind is no longer grounded in what is real, but in what is imagined. Understanding this pattern reveals that most stress is self-generated through attachment, expectation, and resistance rather than imposed by life itself. External events are often neutral until the mind assigns emotional meaning to them. When attachment decreases, the emotional reaction to uncertainty also decreases. The same situation that once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable simply because it is no longer carrying the extra weight of expectation. In this way, stress is not eliminated by changing life, but by changing the way life is mentally held. Detachment is often misunderstood because the word itself creates the impression of distance, indifference, or emotional coldness. But in reality, it is none of these things. It is not the absence of care, nor is it the rejection of meaningful involvement in life. Instead, it is a shift in the way emotional energy is distributed, especially in relation to outcomes that are uncertain and beyond direct control. A person can still care deeply about their goals, relationships, work, and personal growth while practicing detachment. The difference lies in where they place their emotional dependency. When someone is attached, their inner state becomes tied to whether a specific result is achieved. When that result is achieved, there is temporary relief or happiness. And when it is not achieved, there is disappointment, frustration, or even a sense of failure. This creates an unstable emotional cycle where peace is constantly dependent on external validation or success. Detachment breaks this cycle by separating effort from emotional dependence on results. It teaches a person to fully engage in action while remaining internally steady regardless of how the outcome unfolds. This means that effort is still important, planning is still important, and discipline is still required, but emotional stability is no longer handed over to something unpredictable. A person still shows up, still tries, still invests energy, but they do not allow their mental well-being to rise and fall with every external shift. This creates a more balanced relationship with life where actions are performed with sincerity but not with desperation. When emotional dependence on results is reduced, the mind becomes clearer. Instead of constantly worrying about whether something will succeed or fail, attention is redirected toward what can be improved in the present moment. This allows for better decision making because fear of outcomes no longer clouds judgment. Many poor decisions are made not because people lack intelligence, but because they are emotionally attached to a specific outcome and therefore cannot see alternatives objectively. Detachment introduces flexibility into thinking. It allows a person to adjust when things do not go as expected without feeling personally broken by the change. In relationships, this principle is especially important. Caring deeply for someone does not require controlling their behavior or expecting them to act in a certain way at all times. When attachment dominates, love becomes conditional on responses, tension, or validation. This creates emotional instability because human behavior is naturally unpredictable. Detachment in this context means still valuing the relationship, but not basing personal peace on how the other person behaves at every moment. It creates space for understanding rather than control, for communication rather than emotional pressure. In personal goals and ambitions, detachment allows persistence without emotional collapse. A person can work toward a goal for a long time without allowing temporary setbacks to define their self-worth. Failure is no longer interpreted as personal rejection, but as part of the process. Success is appreciated without becoming the only source of identity. This prevents extremes of emotional highs and lows and builds a more stable internal foundation. Instead of being controlled by outcomes, the individual becomes focused on consistent action, which in turn increases the likelihood of success without the emotional burden that usually accompanies it. There is also a psychological relief that comes from detachment. The mind stops constantly projecting into the future and stops repeatedly revisiting possible scenarios that may never occur. Energy that was previously consumed by anticipation, fear, and expectation becomes available for present engagement. This creates a sense of mental spaciousness where thoughts are less chaotic and reactions are less impulsive. The individual becomes more grounded because attention is no longer scattered across countless imagined outcomes. Detachment does not remove ambition or reduce desire. It refines them. Ambition without detachment often leads to stress because it is fueled by urgency and fear of loss. Ambition with detachment becomes healthier because it is driven by purpose rather than anxiety. The person still aims high, but is not mentally collapsing under pressure. They still want progress, but are not dependent on immediate validation from results. This balance allows for sustained effort over time without emotional exhaustion. Ultimately, detachment is about freedom from unnecessary emotional suffering. It allows a person to fully participate in life without being enslaved by outcomes they cannot guarantee. It is the ability to care deeply while remaining internally steady, to act fully while remaining emotionally balanced, and to pursue goals while accepting uncertainty. In this state, life is no longer a constant negotiation between expectation and reality, but a steady flow of action and acceptance working together. The human mind has a natural tendency to seek certainty, and because of that tendency, it often tries to predict, analyze, and mentally simulate every possible outcome before anything actually happens. This creates a continuous internal activity that feels like preparation, but in reality, it often becomes a cycle of overthinking that drains energy without producing real progress. When a person starts to rely on thinking alone as a way to manage uncertainty, the mind begins to believe that if it can just consider enough scenarios, it will somehow gain control over what will happen next. But life does not respond to mental simulation in the way the mind expects. No amount of internal repetition can guarantee external outcomes, yet the mind keeps returning to the same patterns of thought because it temporarily creates a feeling of control. Overthinking often begins with concern, but it gradually transforms into repetition. A situation appears in the mind, and instead of being processed once and released, it is replayed multiple times from different angles. The mind asks questions that do not have immediate answers, imagines worst case scenarios, and then tries to solve those imagined scenarios as if they are real. Huh? This creates a loop where thought feeds itself. Each new layer of thinking gives the illusion of progress, but the situation itself remains unchanged. Meanwhile, emotional tension increases because the nervous system reacts to imagined threats as if they are present reality. Worry is closely connected to this process. When worry takes over, the focus shifts from what is actually happening to what might happen. The present moment loses importance, and attention is pulled into possible futures that are uncertain and often unlikely. The mind starts treating possibility as probability as certainty. This distortion increases anxiety because it makes imagined outcomes feel more real than actual conditions. The body responds to these imagined outcomes with stress response, even though nothing concrete is occurring in the external environment. This is why a person can feel exhausted without taking any physical action. The mental activity itself becomes the source of fatigue. Trying to predict everything is another form of this mental overload. It comes from the belief that if every possible scenario is accounted for, then nothing unexpected will happen. But reality is inherently unpredictable, and no amount of analysis can fully map it out. When a person tries to anticipate every outcome, they begin to stretch their mind across too many possibilities at once. Instead of becoming more prepared, they become mentally scattered. Decisions become harder to make because every option is weighed against imagined risks. Even simple choices start to feel heavy because the mind is carrying too many invisible variables. This constant mental activity also creates emotional exhaustion. Overthinking does not stay in the realm of logic. It quickly moves into emotional experience. Each repeated thought carries a feeling with it, and those feelings accumulate over time. Fear, doubt, frustration, and uncertainty begin to build on one another. The person may not even realize why they feel tired or overwhelmed, because on the surface, nothing significant is happening. But internally, the mind has been running continuously without rest, processing the same ideas again and again without resolution. Another hidden effect of overthinking is loss of clarity. When the mind is filled with excessive analysis, it becomes harder to distinguish between what is important and what is not. Small issues start to feel larger than they are because attention is constantly focused on them. The natural ability to respond simply and directly becomes replaced by hesitation. Instead of acting, the person keeps thinking. Instead of moving forward, they keep evaluating. This delay in action often leads to missed opportunities or unnecessary stress, not because the situation was difficult, but because the mind made it feel more complicated than it actually was. Overthinking also creates a false sense of productivity. Because the mind is constantly active, it feels like something is being done. However, thinking is not the same as action. Reflection is useful when it leads to clarity, but repetitive thinking without direction becomes mental noise. It gives the illusion of control while actually reducing effectiveness. The more time is spent inside mental loops, the less attention is available for real-world engagement. This disconnect between thought and action slowly weakens confidence because progress is not being experienced directly. When this pattern continues for long periods, the mind begins to associate silence with discomfort. Stillness feels unfamiliar because it has been replaced by constant mental movement. As a result, even when there is no real problem, the mind creates one through analysis. It becomes difficult to simply observe a situation without immediately trying to interpret or solve it. This makes relaxation feel unnatural and keeps the system in a constant state of internal activity. The key issue at the core of overthinking, worry, and excessive prediction is the belief that thinking more will lead to better control. But in reality, control does not come from thinking about everything. It comes from knowing when to stop thinking and start acting. When mental energy is continuously spent on possibilities that may never occur, it weakens the ability to respond effectively to what is actually happening. Reducing this habit allows the mind to become more focused, more present, and more capable of dealing with reality as it is rather than as it is imagined to be. A large part of human stress does not come from the events of life themselves, but from the internal struggle against those events. Reality is constantly unfolding in its own direction, yet the mind often resists it by comparing what is happening with what it believes should be happening. This comparison creates tension. Instead of meeting life as it is, the mind tries to correct it in real time through thought, judgment, and emotional reaction. When there is a gap between expectation and reality, resistance fills that gap. This resistance is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it appears as subtle frustration, impatience, disappointment, or constant dissatisfaction with the present moment. Acceptance is often misunderstood as approval, but it is not the same thing. Accepting reality does not mean agreeing with every situation or passively allowing things to remain unchanged. It simply means recognizing what is already present without mentally fighting it. When something happens that is outside of control, the mind has two options. It can resist it by arguing internally, or it can acknowledge it and respond appropriately. Resistance adds an extra layer of emotional suffering on top of the situation itself, while acceptance removes that unnecessary layer and allows clearer thinking. When resistance becomes habitual, even small events begin to feel heavy. A delay feels unbearable, a mistake feels like failure, and an unexpected outcome feels like injustice. The emotional reaction is often stronger than the situation warrants because the mind is not only dealing with the event, but also with its refusal to accept it. This creates a double burden. The first burden is the reality itself, and the second is the mental conflict with that reality. Most of the exhaustion people feel comes from this second layer, not from the external situation alone. Uncertainty is one of the main triggers of resistance. The mind prefers predictability because it creates a sense of safety. When outcomes are uncertain, the mind tries to fill the gap with assumptions and expectations. If those expectations are not met, resistance arises. Instead of adjusting to what is actually happening, the mind continues to hold on to what it expected to happen. This creates emotional friction because attention is divided between the real situation and the imagined one. The more a person clings to how things should be, the more difficult it becomes to respond effectively to how things actually are. Much of this resistance is unconscious. People often do not realize they are fighting reality internally. They may believe they are simply thinking or analyzing, but beneath that thought process is a subtle rejection of the present moment. This rejection keeps the mind in a state of tension, because it is always positioned against something. Even when nothing can be changed, the mind continues to act as if it must change it immediately. This constant opposition prevents relaxation and keeps stress levels elevated. Acceptance introduces a different relationship with experience. Instead of immediately reacting against what is happening, there is a pause where reality is acknowledged as it is. This does not eliminate emotion, but it reduces unnecessary amplification of emotion. A situation may still be difficult, painful, or disappointing, but it is no longer made worse by internal resistance. The energy that was previously used to fight reality becomes available for understanding and response. This shift allows clearer decision-making because attention is no longer split between what is and what should have been. When acceptance becomes more consistent, emotional reactions begin to soften. Events still occur, challenges still arise, and outcomes still vary, but the intensity of suffering decreases. This is because suffering is not only caused by what happens, but by the mental refusal to allow what has already happened to be acknowledged. Once that refusal weakens, the mind becomes more adaptable. It can respond to change without being overwhelmed by it. There is also a deeper psychological benefit to acceptance. It reduces the internal conflict between perception and reality. When the mind is no longer constantly arguing with what is present, there is more mental space available for clarity and presence. Instead of being trapped in judgment, attention can be directed toward understanding what can be done next. This creates a more grounded experience of life, where energy is not wasted on resisting what cannot be altered. Acceptance does not remove challenges, but it changes the way challenges are experienced, the focus from fighting reality to working with it. This reduces unnecessary emotional strain and allows a person to remain more stable, even in difficult conditions. Over time, this stability becomes a foundation for resilience. Because strength is not only built by overcoming external problems, but also by reducing internal resistance to those problems. Real strength is not something that is proven through control over external circumstances, but something that is developed through the consistent ability to turn attention inward and refine what is within personal reach. Many people misunderstand strength as dominance over situations or the ability to force outcomes in their favor. But that kind of approach often leads to frustration because external reality does not always respond to force or desire. True strength begins when a person shifts focus from trying to manage everything outside to improving what is inside, because the only stable ground for growth exists within personal actions, thoughts, habits, and responses. More. Focusing inward means paying attention to the quality of one's own discipline, the consistency of effort, the honesty of intention, and the awareness of how reactions are formed. Instead of spending energy trying to fix or influence external variables, energy is redirected toward refining personal behavior. This includes how a person responds under pressure, how they handle uncertainty, how they manage emotions when things do not go as expected, and how they maintain direction even when motivation fluctuates. These internal elements are always available for improvement, regardless of external conditions, which makes them the most reliable foundation for building strength. When attention is directed inward, self-awareness increases. A person begins to notice patterns in their thinking and behavior that were previously automatic. They start to see how certain reactions are triggered, how certain thoughts repeat, and how certain emotional responses arise in predictable situations. This awareness creates space between stimulus and response. In that space lies the ability to choose a more deliberate reaction instead of being controlled by impulse. Over time, this ability becomes a form of inner stability that is not dependent on external validation or approval. Strength also develops through consistent action. Internal focus is not passive reflection. It is active engagement with one's own improvement. This means showing up even when motivation is low, maintaining discipline when results are not immediate, and continuing effort without needing constant reassurance from outcomes. Each small act of discipline builds resilience because it reinforces the ability to act independently of emotional fluctuations. Instead of relying on external circumstances to feel capable, capability is built through repeated internal commitment. Letting go of what is not within control is another essential aspect of this strength. Many people weaken themselves by carrying mental responsibility for things they cannot influence. They worry about other people's opinions, outcomes that have not yet occurred, and situations that are shaped by countless factors beyond their reach. This creates unnecessary mental weight. When a person learns to release that weight, they regain energy that was previously wasted on resistance and anxiety. Letting go does not mean ignoring life. It means recognizing boundaries between influence and non-influence and respecting those boundaries. As inward focus deepens, emotional reactions become less chaotic. Events still occur and challenges still appear, but the internal response becomes more measured. Instead of immediate frustration or panic, there is observation followed by action. This does not eliminate emotion, but reduces its ability to overwhelm judgment. Strength in this sense is not about suppressing feelings, but about not being controlled by them. Emotional clarity replaces emotional confusion, and decisions become more grounded in reality rather than in fear or expectation. Another important aspect of inward strength is independence from external validation. When self-worth depends heavily on external feedback, a person becomes unstable because external feedback is inconsistent. Praise can come and go, approval can change, and recognition is never fully guaranteed. However, when strength is built inwardly, validation is no longer the primary source of identity. Effort itself becomes meaningful, regardless of whether it is immediately recognized. This creates a more stable sense of self that is not easily shaken by external fluctuation. Over time, focusing inward transforms how a person experiences life. Challenges are no longer seen as threats to identity, but as opportunities to refine response. Failure is no longer interpreted as personal collapse, but as information for adjustment. Success is no longer treated as final validation, but as part of a continuing process. This perspective reduces emotional extremes and creates a more balanced internal state where growth becomes continuous rather than conditional. Ultimately, strength built inwardly is sustainable because it does not depend on controlling the uncontrollable. It is based on mastery of attention, discipline of behavior, clarity of response, and acceptance of limits. Instead of being scattered across everything happening outside, energy is concentrated on what can actually be shaped from within. In that concentration, a quiet but powerful form of stability develops, allowing a person to move through life with steadiness, even when external circumstances remain uncertain. When all of these understandings come together, a natural shift begins to take place in the way a person experiences life. The constant urge to control everything slowly loses its grip, and what replaces it is a quieter, more grounded way of moving through situations. Instead of reacting to every external change with tension or overthinking, there's a growing ability to pause, observe, and respond with clarity. Life does not become free of challenges, but the internal struggle against those challenges starts to reduce. A person begins to realize that peace was never meant to come from perfect control over outcomes, but from understanding the limits of control and focusing energy where it actually matters. In that space, effort becomes more meaningful, decisions become more stable, and emotions become less chaotic. Gradually, the mind learns that it does not need to fight reality to live well within it.